Action to today's historic meeting are Senators Tom Cotton, Arkansas, Lindsey Graham, South Carolina. Lindsey, start with you. A couple of things really stand out to me. Vladimir Putin saying to the world, this war never would have happened had Donald Trump been president. Donald Trump, scale of 1 to 10, gives it a 10. I took a lot away from this interview. Your thoughts?
Number one, I don't really care what. I blame Putin more than anybody else for starting the war. I want to be clear about that. But let me tell you, I've never been more hopeful this war can end honorably and justly than I am right now. The news you made in this interview, to me, is earth-shattering. President Trump said that Putin wants him to meet with Zelensky. That Putin is now apparently agreeing to a trilateral meeting between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. That's the biggest breakthrough of the night. I've never heard that before. If we have that meeting, I think there will be an honorable and just end to this war before Christmas, well before Christmas. If that meeting doesn't come about, then I think Trump's going to have to use severe consequences against Putin and those who buy his oil and gas.
Senator Cotton, what was your big takeaways of this?
Yes, Sean, I agree. That would be a very critical meeting between Presidents Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. There's no ceasefire coming out of this meeting today, but also I thought President Trump stood firm in defense of U.S. interests and also our friends in Europe and Ukraine. This is in contrast, for instance, to Joe Biden's summit with Vladimir Putin in the summer of 2021. In just 2 months, we saw the collapse of Kabul, and then 2 months after that, we saw Vladimir Putin begin to mass forces on Ukraine's border. So I think it was an inconclusive meeting, but an important step forward. And as Lindsey said, if that leads to direct negotiations between the presidents of Ukraine and Russia, I think we'd be in a position to have a durable and stable peace that protects Ukraine's territory, autonomy, and sovereignty, and allows it to build for its future.
Yeah. Oh, well, Senator Cotton, the president was kind of clear in the lead up to this meeting. He did not overpromise and underdeliver here. He did not say he was going to negotiate a peace settlement. He said he was here to see if there was a path forward. Clearly, he believes that there is. Apparently, based on everything that I heard and read that Vladimir Putin said, I was in the room at the time. I don't understand or speak Russian, but having a readout of it, it seems like he feels that there is a path forward and wants President Trump to be a part of it. That was the stated purpose, was it not?
Yes, Sean. I think the president appropriately set and measured expectations for the meeting. Vladimir Putin has been waging this war of aggression for 3.5 years now. I think the first step is going to be a ceasefire. We didn't have that today, but hopefully in the weeks ahead, especially if the presidents of Ukraine and Russia can sit down, there'll be a ceasefire, which can stop the killing at least temporarily, and then move on to that durable peace settlement. I think this was an important first step. Again, President Trump said he didn't expect to have any kind of major breakthrough today, but he did hope that it would set some groundwork for future talks, and it sounds like that's what happened.
Yeah. Senator Graham, what would you like to see as next steps? I did bring up with the president, I said, in most people's minds, and you had made similar comments that there's going to be land swaps. There probably will be, I would assume, the Donbass region, which is about 80% Russian national, will remain with Russia. But what Ukraine is obviously going to want out of this more than anything else, they have got to have security guarantees, non-NATO related. And that would mean, obviously, a good relationship with the United States, their ability to purchase weapons. And, of course, Europe is going to have to step up.
Yeah. Well, the infrastructure of deterrence is what Biden and Obama failed to deliver. When Putin invaded in 2014 and 2022 on Obama and Biden's watch, there was no telling Putin, you better not do it again. I have all the confidence in the world that Donald Trump will make it clear to Putin, this war will never start again. If it does, you're going to pay a heavy price. Security guarantees for Ukraine. So if Putin invades in the future, he'll be fighting a coalition of the willing, just not Ukraine. That American weapons will flow to the Ukrainian military in perpetuity. They'll have the strongest army on the continent of Europe. That we'll have pre-invasion sanctions to hit Putin if he ever does this again. There will be land swaps. You can't evict every Russian, but the Ukrainians will make that deal, not the United States. Ukraine will make that deal. And Trump set in motion the end of this war. Now, I've never been more optimistic than I am right now. Tom is right. There's no ceasefire. But when Trump told you, and this is breaking news as far as I'm concerned, that Putin wants to meet with me and Zelensky, that sets in motion an end of the war. And let me tell you this. If he does meet with Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, and there's no end of this war, Trump will crush the Russian economy.
Well, I think that's what the president said. There'd be dire consequences if, in fact,
Yes.
This meeting did not go well today. That's not happening. And he even went a little step further when he said he didn't think he had to go back to China in terms of their import of oil. Let's go back, Senator Cotton. Remember, Crimea was under Obama and Biden. And as Putin was amassing troops on the Ukrainian border in 2021, troops and military equipment, Joe Biden never picked up a phone, never called Vladimir Putin. Joe Biden, famously said, "Don't." That was echoed by Kamala Harris. And then, of course, well, what happens if? Well, it depends if it's a minor incursion. Donald Trump is involving himself pretty much in every conflict around the world. He explained that while he's talking about trade with these countries, he's also talking peace with these countries. There's really not the trade deals obviously impact the United States. Peace in the world just saves lives, and he seems heavily invested in it. And I don't think a lot of world leaders are willing to expend the political capital to do that.
No, I don't think so either, Sean. Strength and resolution matters tremendously in the conduct of foreign policy and national security, and you put it well. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine when Barack Obama was president. He did it again when Joe Biden was president. He seems to do it when Democrats are president because they are weak and irresolute. But as he himself said today, he didn't do it when President Trump was in his first term, and he takes President Trump seriously today. That's the kind of strength and resolution that we need, not just in Ukraine, but we saw in Iran, we see in the war in Gaza, and that we've seen in these trade negotiations as well. It makes a big difference to have a strong president back in the White House.
All right, Senator Cotton, Senator Graham, thank you both for being with us tonight. When we come back, peace through strength.